The Obsidian Labyrinth. By David Hall. December 3, 2025. Chapter List. Chapter 1, The Whispering Walls. Chapter 2, The Crimson Tide. Chapter 3, Echoes of Madness. Chapter 4, The Butcher's Gallery. Chapter 5, Descent into Flesh. Chapter 6, The Heart of the Maze. Chapter 7, Shattered Reflections. Chapter 8, The Unmaking. Summary. In a twisted, biomechanical labyrinth of a forgotten, far-future Forge world, a squad of elite Imperial Guardsmen are sent on a desperate mission to retrieve a lost relic. As they navigate the ever-shifting corridors and face grotesque, cybernetically enhanced horrors, their sanity and their bodies are pushed to the absolute limit, revealing the terrifying secrets at the heart of the Obsidian Labyrinth. Chapter 1, The Whispering Walls. The transport shuddered violently before slamming into the ferrocrete landing pad with a teeth-jarring clang. Sergeant Karas, a veteran of countless hellholes across the Imperium, felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in his gut. This place, it felt wrong. Even through the thick plasteel of their landing craft, a low, resonant hum vibrated in the air, a sound that seemed to claw at the edges of his mind. "All right, you scumlickers, listen up," Karas bellowed, his voice amplified by the voxcaster built into his helmet. 10 figures, clad in the drab fatigues and heavy flak armor of the Imperial Guard, shifted nervously in the cramped confines of the transport. They were the remnants of Kadian 77th's elite stormtrooper unit, hardened by years of frontline combat, yet the oppressive atmosphere of this forsaken world seemed to weigh heavily on them. "Our objective is clear," Karas continued, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "Retrieve the Aegis Maleficum from within this structure. High Command believes it holds vital information. Intel is scarce, to say the least. Expect the worst." The ramp hissed open, revealing a cyclopean archway of obsidian-like metal, pulsating with faint, internal light. Strange, fleshy tendrils snaked across its surface, twitching with an unnatural life. The air outside was thick with the stench of ozone and decay, a metallic tang that made Karas's nostrils flare. "Move out. Lasgun's hot." They filed out into a vast, cavernous space. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thrumming and the soft squelch of their boots on the metallic floor. The walls around them were not smooth, but textured with intricate, unsettling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in their peripheral vision. Whispers, faint and indistinct, brushed against their ears, too low to understand, yet undeniably present. "Did you hear that?" Private Lyra, a fresh recruit despite her grim expression, whispered, her hand instinctively tightening on her lasgun. "Just the wind, girl," Karas grunted, though he himself had felt a prickle of unease. There was no wind in this enclosed space. They advanced cautiously, their lasguns held at the ready. The corridor ahead twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the labyrinthine structure. Strange, organic-looking conduits pulsed with a sickly green light, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. Suddenly, a section of the wall bulged outwards, tearing open with a wet, tearing sound. A creature erupted from the opening, a nightmarish fusion of flesh and metal, its limbs ending in razor-sharp claws, its face a mass of exposed wires and milky white eyes. It shrieked, a high-pitched, grating sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Contact! Engage!" Karas roared, unleashing a volley of lost fire. The crimson beams tore through the creature's flesh, but it barely seemed to notice, its metallic limbs scything through the air. Corporal Valerius, a hulking figure armed with a heavy bolter, opened fire. Explosive rounds ripped chunks out of the creature, finally bringing it down in a shower of sparks and gore. "Move! This place is crawling with them," Karas yelled, pushing his squad forward. They pressed on, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, Sibilant voices just beyond the threshold of comprehension, weaving insidious suggestions into their minds. Paranoia began to take root, glances exchanged, trust eroding in the oppressive atmosphere. Another attack came swiftly. From the shadows, more of the biomechanical horrors lunged, their movements unnervingly swift and silent. Lost fire erupted, the air filled with the smell of burnt flesh and ozone. Private Chen was the first to fall, his throat torn open by a blade appendage, his lifeblood staining the metallic floor. Medic! Damn it, where's the medic? Karas roared, his voice laced with fury and fear. They didn't have a medic. They were a stripped-down squad, sent in with minimal support. The corridor narrowed, the walls closing in. The whispers intensified, becoming almost coherent, weaving tales of pain and suffering, of eternal torment. Lyra screamed, clutching her head, her eyes wide with terror. They're in my head. I can hear them. Before anyone could react, the wall beside her rippled, and a long, metallic tentacle shot out, impaling her through the chest. Her body went limp, her lasgun clattering to the floor. No! Karas roared, firing blindly into the wall. It did nothing. The tentacle retracted, pulling Lyra's lifeless body back into the pulsating flesh of the wall. The remaining guardsmen exchanged horrified glances. This wasn't just a fight, it was a descent into madness. The walls themselves were alive, malevolent, and hungry. Chapter 2, The Crimson Tide. Panic threatened to overwhelm the remaining 8 guardsmen. The sudden and brutal deaths of Chen and Lyra had shattered their initial resolve. The whispering walls seemed to mock their fear, the sibilant voices growing louder, weaving themselves into their thoughts, preying on their deepest anxieties. Form ranks. Stay together. Karas bellowed, struggling to maintain control. He knew that if they broke, they were doomed. They moved forward in a tight formation, their lasguns sweeping the corridors. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every flicker of light a potential ambush. The metallic floor beneath their boots was slick in places with a viscous, black fluid that smelled faintly of blood and oil. Suddenly, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. In the center of the room, a grotesque machine pulsed with an eerie green light. Tubes and wires snaked across its surface, connected to what appeared to be organic components, pulsating hearts and writhing tendrils. The whispers in their minds intensified, focusing on the machine, a chorus of suffering and despair. What in the Emperor's name? Valerius muttered, his heavy bolter wavering in his grip. Before they could react, the floor beneath them began to shift and buckle. Metallic tendrils erupted from the ground, lashing out like whips. Sergeant Major Volkov, a stoic veteran with a cybernetic eye, was the first to be caught. A tendril wrapped around his leg, dragging him towards the pulsating machine. Volkov! Karas yelled, firing his lasgun at the tendril. The energy bolt seared the metal, but it held fast. Volkov roared in agony as he was pulled closer to the machine. They could see now that the organic components were not just parts of the machine, but were fused with human bodies, twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes, their silent screams echoing in the whispers. Another tendril snaked out, impaling Volkov through the chest. His body convulsed violently before going limp, his cybernetic eye dimming. The tendril retracted, dragging his corpse into the heart of the machine. Emperor, protect us! Private Anya whispered, her face pale with terror. The chamber was now alive with the metallic tendrils, lashing out with terrifying speed and precision. The guardsmen scattered, desperately trying to avoid their deadly embrace. Lost fire ripped through the air, but the tendrils seemed impervious to their energy blasts. Corporal Marius, a quiet and unassuming soldier, was caught off guard. A tendril wrapped around his waist, squeezing the air from his lungs. He screamed, his face contorted in agony as his ribs cracked under the immense pressure. Another tendril pierced his side, and his struggles ceased. Karas gritted his teeth, his lasgun spitting bolts of crimson energy. He managed to sever one tendril, but two more lunged at him. He dodged one, but the other grazed his arm, tearing through his flak armor and drawing a searing line of pain. He retreated, firing as he went, trying to draw the creatures away from the others. He saw Private Garza disappear beneath a mass of writhing tendrils, his screams abruptly cut short. Only 5 remained now: Karas, Valerius, Anya, Private Tremaine, and Private Hess. They were cornered, the pulsating machine looming over them, the whispers a deafening cacophony in their minds. "We need to get out of here," Anya cried, her voice trembling. "There's nowhere to go," Tremaine shouted back, firing wildly at the encroaching tendrils. Valerius, his face grim, heft his heavy bolter. "I'll try to take out that machine. It's the source of this madness." He advanced, his heavy bolter roaring, explosive rounds tearing into the grotesque machinery. Sparks flew, and chunks of metal and organic matter were ripped away. The whispers intensified, a chorus of enraged shrieks. The tendrils focused their attack on Valerius, lashing out with renewed ferocity. One wrapped around his legs, tripping him. He fell to the ground, his heavy bolter clattering beside him. Before he could react, a dozen tendrils pierced his body, turning him into a bloody pincushion. His dying roar was drowned out by the triumphant shrieks of the machine. Karas watched in horror as Valerius's life was extinguished. Only 4 of them were left now, trapped in a chamber of horrors, facing a foe they couldn't even comprehend. The crimson tide of their comrades' blood seemed to stain the very air they breathed. Chapter 3, Echoes of Madness. The death of Valerius broke something within the remaining guardsmen. The sheer brutality and alien nature of their attackers had eroded their discipline, replacing it with a raw, primal fear. The whispers in their minds were no longer just background noise, they were insidious voices, planting seeds of doubt and despair. "We're all going to die here," Tremaine muttered, his eyes wide and unfocused. He continued to fire his lasgun, but his movements were jerky and uncoordinated. "Shut up, Tremaine," Karas snapped, trying to maintain a semblance of control. "We need to find a way out. There has to be one." He scanned the chamber frantically, his gaze sweeping over the pulsating machine and the network of corridors that led away from it. Each passage looked identical, a claustrophobic tunnel of whispering metal. Anya suddenly screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the walls. "Look! They're moving." Karas followed her gaze. The intricate patterns on the walls seemed to be shifting, the fleshy tendrils subtly writhing. He could have sworn he saw faces forming within the metallic surfaces, contorted in silent agony. "It's just your imagination, Anya," Karas said, though his own heart pounded with unease. He wasn't sure what was real anymore and what was a product of the oppressive atmosphere and the incessant whispers. Hess, a quiet and usually reliable soldier, suddenly turned on Tremaine, his eyes filled with a wild, accusatory light. "It's your fault. You brought this bad luck on us." "What? What are you talking about?" Tremaine stammered, backing away from Hess's crazed gaze. "You were always weak. Always complaining. Now we're all going to pay for it?" Hess lunged at Tremaine, his hands reaching for his throat. "Hess! Stand down!" Karas roared, but his command fell on deaf ears. Tremaine struggled, but Hess's grip was surprisingly strong. His face turned purple as Hess squeezed the life out of him. Anya screamed again, firing her lasgun wildly at Hess. The energy bolt struck him in the chest, but he barely flinched, his eyes still fixed on Tremaine's dying face. Karas reacted instantly, bringing the butt of his lasgun down hard on the back of Hess's head. The private crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "What in the hells was that?" Karas demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. The whispers seemed to be feeding on their fear, driving them to madness. He just snapped," Anya stammered, her face pale. Karas knew they couldn't stay here. The chamber was a death trap, and the psychological toll was proving just as deadly as the physical threats. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to find the objective and get the hell out of this place." He chose a corridor at random and started to move, Anya following close behind, her lasgun held nervously in her hands. They left Hessa's unconscious body and Tremaine's corpse behind, grim reminders of the horrors they had already faced. The corridor they entered was even more oppressive than the last. The walls were slick with the black fluid, and the whispers were almost deafening now, a constant barrage of voices that seemed to be speaking directly into their minds. They spoke of pain, of betrayal, of the futility of resistance. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, glowing faintly with an internal light. They seemed to writhe and shift as Karas looked at them, their forms vaguely unsettling, hinting at forbidden knowledge and unspeakable rituals. Suddenly, the corridor ahead of them shimmered and distorted. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp, and for a moment, Karas felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, as if the ground beneath his feet had dissolved. "What was that?" Anya whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know," Karas said, his voice barely above a whisper. He had never encountered anything like this before. This place wasn't just a structure, it was something else, something alive and malevolent, twisting reality to its own horrific ends. They continued cautiously, their senses on high alert. The whispers continued, weaving their way into their minds, preying on their fears and their memories. Karas found himself thinking of his fallen comrades, their faces contorted in pain and terror. He could almost hear their screams echoing in the whispers. He knew that if they stayed here much longer, they would all succumb to the madness. They had to find the Aegis Maleficum and escape, before this place consumed them entirely, body and soul. The echoes of madness were growing louder, and he could feel his own sanity beginning to fray at the edges. Chapter 4, The Butcher's Gallery. The corridor opened into another vast chamber, but this one was unlike anything they had seen before. The walls were lined with grotesque displays, bodies, or what remained of them, fused with the metallic structure of the labyrinth. Limbs protruded from the walls at unnatural angles, faces were frozen in silent screams, and organs pulsed with a sickly green light. The whispers here were almost unbearable, a cacophony of agony and despair. The stench of decay and blood was overwhelming, making Karas gag. "By the throne," Anya whispered, her face a mask of horror. She clutched her lasgun tightly, her knuckles white. Karas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't just a structure, it was a charnel house, a testament to unimaginable cruelty and suffering. He could only imagine the horrors that had taken place here. In the center of the chamber, suspended from the ceiling by thick, metallic chains, was a figure that made their blood run cold. It was a space marine, his power armor twisted and mangled, his body grotesquely augmented with cybernetics and fused with the machinery of the room. His head lolled lifelessly, but his eyes, milky white and vacant, seemed to stare directly at them. "Asteroids," Karas breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread. Even a mighty warrior of the Adeptus Asteroids had fallen victim to this place. As they stared at the horrifying spectacle, the Space Marine's head suddenly snapped up, its vacant eyes focusing on them with unnatural intensity. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest. "It's alive!" Anya screamed, firing her lasgun. The energy bolt struck the Space Marine's armor, but it barely seemed to register. The chains holding the Space Marine began to rattle, and the creature swung towards them, its mutated limbs twitching. Razor-sharp claws extended from its gaunt-leafed hands. "Fall back!" Karas yelled, pushing Anya behind him. The mutated Space Marine lunged, its movements surprisingly swift despite its grotesque modifications. Karas raised his lasgun and fired a sustained burst, aiming for the creature's head. The energy bolt struck its helmet, cracking the ceramite, but the creature pressed on. It swiped with its claws, tearing through Karaz's flak armor and leaving deep gashes in his arm. Pain lanced through him, but he gritted his teeth and fired again. Anya, recovering from her initial shock, joined the attack, her lasgun spitting crimson bolts. The combined fire seemed to slow the mutated space marine, but it was still advancing relentlessly. "We need something heavier," Karaz yelled, his voice strained with pain. Suddenly, a section of the wall behind them shuddered and collapsed, revealing another corridor. "This way!" Karaz shouted, dragging Anya with him. They scrambled through the opening just as the mutated space marine reached them, its claws tearing through the air where they had just been. They found themselves in a narrow, winding corridor. The whispers here were different, more focused, almost seductive. They spoke of power, of transformation, of becoming something more. "Don't listen to them," Karaz grunted, his head throbbing. "It's trying to trick us." They pressed on, the corridor twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the labyrinth. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and change as they looked at them. They depicted grotesque figures engaged in unspeakable acts, their faces contorted in ecstasy and agony. Suddenly, they heard a noise ahead, a wet, dragging sound, followed by a low moan. They rounded a corner and saw a figure slumped against the wall. It was Hess, the private Karaz had knocked unconscious. He was alive, but barely. His eyes were wide with terror, and his body was covered in the black fluid that seemed to permeate this place. "Karaz. Anya," he croaked, his voice weak and raspy. It got me, it's inside." Before they could reach him, Hess's body began to convulse violently. His skin rippled and bulged, and metallic protrusions erupted from his flesh. His moans turned into guttural shrieks as his body was transformed into another one of the grotesque fusions of flesh and metal that inhabited this labyrinth. Karaz stared in horror as Hess's transformation completed. The creature that had once been his comrade lunged at them, its movements jerky and unnatural. "No. Not again!" Anya screamed, firing her lasgun. The energy bolts tore into the creature, but it continued to advance, driven by some unholy purpose. Karaz drew his combat knife, the cold steel a small comfort in this nightmare. He knew that they couldn't afford to hesitate. If they didn't kill this thing, it would kill them. He charged, his knife flashing in the dim light. He managed to sever one of the creature's limbs, but it retaliated with surprising speed, its metallic claws tearing into his side. Karaz cried out in pain, but he pressed on, his knife finding its mark. He plunged the blade into the creature's chest, again and again, until it finally collapsed, its body twitching spasmodically. He stood over the corpse of his former comrade, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. He knew that this place was testing them, pushing them to their limits, both physically and mentally. And he feared that they were failing. Chapter 5, Descent into Flesh. Karaz leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The wounds on his arm and side throbbed with pain, and he could feel the lifeblood seeping through his tattered uniform. Anya knelt beside him, her face etched with worry. "You're losing a lot of blood," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's nothing," Karaz grunted, though he knew it was a lie. He was growing weaker with every passing moment. He looked at the creature that had once been Hess. The transformation was complete, the organic and the mechanical fused into a grotesque parody of life. He wondered how many others had suffered the same fate, their bodies twisted and corrupted by this place. "We can't stay here," Karaz said, pushing himself to his feet. "We need to keep moving." Anya helped him up, her arm supporting his weight. They continued down the corridor, their movements slow and labored. The whispers continued, their seductive voices promising power and salvation, but Karaz knew better. He knew that this place offered only death and damnation. The corridor opened into a vast, pulsating chamber. The walls were lined with fleshy growths that pulsed with a sickly green light, and the air was thick with the stench of decay and the metallic tang of blood. In the center of the chamber, a massive, organic structure dominated the space. It was a grotesque fusion of flesh and metal, a pulsating heart of the labyrinth. What is that? Anya whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. I don't know, Karas said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't like it. As they approached the structure, the whispers intensified, becoming a deafening chorus of voices that seemed to be coming from the structure itself. They spoke of unity, of transcendence, of becoming one with the machine. Suddenly, the structure pulsed, and a wave of energy washed over them. Karas felt a searing pain in his head, and his vision blurred. He could feel his thoughts being invaded, his memories being probed. Resist it, he yelled, clutching his head. Don't let it in. Anya cried out, collapsing to her knees. Her body began to convulse, and her skin rippled and bulged. Karas watched in horror as his last remaining comrade was transformed into another grotesque abomination. No. Anya, he screamed, but it was too late. The transformation was complete. Anya, or what was left of her, turned towards him, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. Join us, Karas, she said, her voice a distorted mockery of Anya's. Become one with the machine. Embrace the future. Karas recoiled in horror. He couldn't believe what was happening. He was alone now, surrounded by the twisted remains of his comrades. And the labyrinth was trying to claim him as well. He knew that he couldn't fight it. He was too weak, too injured. But he refused to surrender. He would not become another puppet of this grotesque place. With a desperate cry, he charged towards the pulsating structure, his combat knife held high. He would destroy this heart of darkness, even if it cost him his life. The structure pulsed again, and a wave of metallic tendrils lashed out at him. Karas dodged and weaved, his movements fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He managed to sever several tendrils, but more kept coming, their metallic claws tearing into his flesh. He was losing. He could feel his strength waning, his body giving out. But he pressed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to give up. Finally, he reached the core of the structure. It was a pulsating mass of flesh and metal, a grotesque parody of a human heart. Karas plunged his knife into the heart, again and again, until it ruptured, and a torrent of black fluid gushed out. The structure convulsed violently, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. Karas felt a searing pain throughout his body, as if his very being was being torn apart. Then, silence. The pulsating light of the structure dimmed, and the fleshy growths on the walls began to wither and die. The labyrinth seemed to exhale, its grip on reality loosening. Karas collapsed to his knees, his body broken and bleeding. He had done it. He had destroyed the heart of the labyrinth. But at what cost? He looked around at the chamber, at the twisted remains of his comrades. They were silent now, their grotesque forms still and lifeless. He was the only one left. He knew that he couldn't stay here. He had to get out, before the labyrinth claimed him as well. With a supreme effort, he pushed himself to his feet and began to stumble towards the exit, leaving behind the horrors of the descent into flesh. Chapter 6, The Heart of the Maze. Karas dragged himself through the labyrinth, his body screaming in protest with every step. The corridors seemed to shift and change around him, the walls twisting and turning, as if the structure itself was trying to disorient him. The whispers were gone, but the silence that replaced them was almost as unnerving, a heavy, oppressive stillness that weighed down on his soul. He moved on, driven by a primal need to escape. His vision blurred, and he stumbled, his hand trailing along the cold, metallic walls for support. He passed chambers filled with grotesque machinery and nightmarish displays, each one a testament to the horrors that had taken place within these walls. He saw the mangled remains of his squad, their bodies twisted and fused with the labyrinth's architecture. Volkov, his cybernetic eye dimmed and lifeless, integrated into a pulsating machine. Marius, his ribcage crushed, protruding from a wall. Tremaine, his face frozen in a silent scream, forever part of the labyrinth's twisted gallery. Each sight was a knife twist in Karaz's already wounded spirit, a stark reminder of his failure. He had led these men into this hell, and only he remained. The weight of their deaths pressed down on him, threatening to crush him under its immense burden. As he ventured deeper, the labyrinth began to play tricks on his mind. He saw glimpses of his past, his childhood home on Kadaya, his fallen comrades from previous campaigns, his face reflected in the metallic walls, aged and scarred beyond recognition. These visions flickered and danced before his eyes, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. He wasn't sure how long he wandered, lost in the labyrinth's twisted embrace. Time seemed to have no meaning here, the hours stretching into an eternity of pain and despair. He was running on fumes, his body and mind pushed to their absolute limits. Finally, he stumbled into a vast chamber, the largest he had yet encountered. In the center of the room, bathed in an eerie green light, was the Aegis Maleficum. It was a crystalline structure, pulsating with an otherworldly energy, its surface covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and writhe before his eyes. Karaz stared at the artifact, his mission objective. It was so close, yet it felt miles away. He was weak, barely able to stand, and the chamber seemed to radiate a palpable sense of dread, as if the labyrinth itself was warning him to stay away. As he approached the Aegis Maleficum, the floor beneath him began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the metallic surface, and sections of the floor started to rise and fall, creating a treacherous, shifting maze. The chamber was transforming, becoming a final obstacle, a last, desperate attempt by the labyrinth to prevent him from escaping with the artifact. Karaz knew that this was it, his final test. He had to reach the Aegis Maleficum, or he would be trapped here forever, a prisoner of this nightmare realm. With a surge of adrenaline, fueled by sheer desperation, Karaz began to navigate the shifting maze. He leaped across chasms, dodged falling debris, and scrambled over rising platforms, his movements clumsy but determined. The labyrinth threw everything it had at him. Walls slammed shut, forcing him to change direction. Tendrils of metal snaked out from the floor, trying to ensnare him. The very air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy, assaulting his senses and trying to break his will. But Karaz pressed on, driven by the memory of his fallen comrades and the faint glimmer of hope that he might actually escape this hell. He would not let their deaths be in vain. He would complete his mission, no matter the cost. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reached the center of the chamber. The Aegis Maleficum pulsed before him, its crystalline surface humming with power. Karaz reached out and touched it, his hand trembling. As his fingers made contact, a surge of energy coursed through his body. He felt a moment of pure, blinding light, followed by an overwhelming sense of peace. The pain and the fear vanished, replaced by a profound sense of calm. But the calm was fleeting. The labyrinth reacted violently to his touch, the chamber shaking and groaning as if in its death throes. The floor beneath him crumbled, and the walls began to close in, threatening to crush him. Karaz knew that he had to get out of here, now. He grabbed the Aegis Maleficum and turned to flee, the labyrinth collapsing around him. Chapter 7, Shattered Reflections. Karaz fled the collapsing chamber, the Aegis Maleficum clutched tightly in his hand. The labyrinth was in chaos, the walls and floors crumbling, the grotesque machinery groaning and sparking as it was torn apart. He stumbled through the twisting corridors, barely able to see through the dust and debris. The structure seemed to be actively trying to kill him now, the very metal of its being contorting and shifting to block his escape. He dodged falling debris, squeezed through narrowing passages, and narrowly avoided being crushed by collapsing walls. His injuries slowed him down, each step sending waves of pain through his body. He was running on pure adrenaline and willpower, his vision blurring, his strength fading. He knew that he couldn't keep this up for much longer. As he ran, he saw glimpses of his past reflected in the crumbling walls. He saw his childhood home on Kadaya, now a shattered ruin. He saw his fallen comrades, their faces contorted in pain and terror. He saw himself, his face aged and scarred, a broken reflection of the man he once was. The labyrinth was taunting him, forcing him to confront his deepest fears and regrets. It was trying to break him, to shatter his spirit, to claim him as its own. But Karas refused to yield. He would not let this place consume him. He would not let the deaths of his comrades be in vain. He would escape, and he would bring the Aegis Maleficum back to the Imperium, no matter the cost. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he saw a light ahead. It was the exit, the way out of this nightmare. With a final surge of strength, he stumbled towards it, the labyrinth collapsing around him. He burst out of the structure just as it crumbled behind him, collapsing into a heap of twisted metal and organic matter. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath, the Aegis Maleficum pulsing softly in his hand. He had made it. He had survived the horrors of the Obsidian Labyrinth. But he was not the same man who had entered it. He was broken, scarred, haunted by the memories of what he had seen and done. He looked back at the ruins of the labyrinth, a twisted monument to death and despair. He knew that he would never forget this place, the horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost. The experience had changed him, shattering his perceptions of the universe and leaving him with a profound sense of loss and trauma. The reflections of his former self were shattered, replaced by the grim reality of his survival. He turned away from the ruins and began to walk, his steps slow and heavy. He had a mission to complete, a duty to fulfill. But he knew that a part of him would always remain in the Obsidian Labyrinth, trapped in its twisted embrace. Chapter 8, The Unmaking. Karas made his way back to the extraction point, the Aegis Maleficum his only companion in the desolate landscape. The transport ship arrived, its engines whining as it touched down on the ruined landing pad. As he boarded the ship, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from afar. He was physically present, but his mind was still trapped in the labyrinth, reliving the horrors he had endured. The pilot, a young woman with a grim expression, stared at him with a mixture of awe and pity. She could see the pain and the trauma etched on his face, the haunted look in his eyes. What happened down there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karas didn't answer. He couldn't find the words to describe the horrors he had witnessed, the madness he had endured. How could he explain the living walls, the grotesque fusions of flesh and metal, the whispers that invaded his mind? He simply shook his head and clutched the Aegis Maleficum tighter, as if it were the only thing grounding him to reality. The transport ship took off, leaving behind the ruined forge world and the horrors of the Obsidian Labyrinth. As they ascended into the blackness of space, Karas looked out the viewport, watching the planet shrink into a distant speck. He knew that he was carrying more than just the Aegis Maleficum. He was carrying the memories of his fallen comrades, the weight of his failure, the scars of his trauma. He was carrying the unmaking of his former self. The mission was complete. The objective was achieved. But at what cost? Karas closed his eyes, trying to shut out the images that haunted his mind. But it was no use. The labyrinth had left its mark on him, a mark that would never fade. He was a broken man, forever changed by the horrors he had witnessed. He had descended into the depths of madness and emerged, something else. The whispers were gone, but the silence was deafening. And in that silence, he could still hear the echoes of the unmaking. The end.